Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
Well, this is a terribly exciting week, Wendy.
Oh, man.
And I'll tell you that there's three reasons why I'm excited. Number one, we have a Patreon hangout scheduled for Tuesday, April 10th.
That's right.
So if you are part of the Patreon community, make sure you get back to us or give the thumbs up or whatever, or respond to the invite so we know you're coming.
Hopefully you can make it. Otherwise, we will have another one very soon. And, let us know your preferred day for that because we care about you and we want you to be there.
Yes,
so
we do.
We will schedule it around you.
So that's the first thing that's very exciting. So April 10th is already, I am bursting at the seams with excitement.
We have so much to talk about.
But it's also
too.
Friday the 13th is on Friday, and everybody loves a good Friday the 13th.
They sure do.
That's right. So Friday the 13th this April is especially exciting because we are releasing our brand new CD, The Wonders of the Invisible World, that day in Madison.
Yay.
So if you guys are anywhere near Madison, come to the show. It's going to be awesome. And then you can find out more about that. Sunspotmusic.com/tickets is where you can pick up your ticket. You can get a copy of the new CD and a t-shirt, the whole deal for $20.
Swag bag,
Yes.
baby.
So that's the other thing we're really excited about. New music coming right this Friday and Patreon hangout this week. And we got some appearances coming up on the terrestrial radio. So if you're not into the podcasting world and just have like a dial, like maybe old transistor radio, will appear on your old transistor radio as well.
We will.
Yes.
Yeah. And if you don't have that, you can always tune in through the interwebs radio.
So we have there's just a ton of stuff going on this week. So that's the first couple of reasons I'm excited.
Yay.
And
Woo.
the next reason I'm excited is that our guest for the show today is the first member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame we've had on the show.
Whoa. Hopefully not the last.
Yes, hopefully not the last.
But very exciting.
Hopefully some more members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame have paranormal stories they can share with us, because certainly Gary Lachman does. Now, the thing is, Gary's name when he was a full-time rocker in the 70s in New York, it was Gary Valentine.
Ah, okay.
So he went by Gary Valentine, and he was the original bass player of the band Blondie. He wrote their first top 10 hit. And he also was the guitar player for Iggy Pop for a couple of years.
Amazing. Just amazing.
Yeah, and his band was called The No. We get into a lot of that in the interview. But it's just really exciting because I was introduced to Gary's books, I don't know, about 15 years ago. And his writing on the occult is just fascinating. His book, The Secret History of Consciousness, I really was like, wow, I'd never thought about these things before. And he really introduced a non-materialist perspective into my reading world.
Well, I'm really excited now to hear what he
Yes.
has to say. So why don't we go straight to the interview?
Yeah, we got to jump in. Okay, here's Gary. Gary Lachman is a writer and researcher with an extraordinary appreciation for the occult and the Western esoteric tradition. A biographer of Helena Blavatsky, Emanuel Swedenborg, and our favorite, holy moly, it's Aleister Crowley. Lachman has helped define just how these iconoclastic thinkers have influenced prevailing culture. A Secret History of Consciousness and a Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, and his upcoming Dark Star Rising, Magic and Power in the Age of Trump, in some ways seem to be a roadmap to human betterment. Gary, thanks for joining us today. I know that my sister hopes you can give us some practical tips for how we can evolve into a higher state of being. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. Gary, welcome from London.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Gary.
How's the weather in London today?
Oh, it's actually all right. We had a lot of rain over the Easter week. Had some sun the last 2 days, but it's got quite mild, so it's pretty warm for this time of year here, and it's not bad. If it's not raining, it's a good day. Put it that way.
I was just there last week, and it is beautiful. It is green and like mossy, and there's flowers, like big flowers. We have no flowers over here in Wisconsin.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, but
It's like
we'll have to send some over after Brexit. We can make a special deal.
Oh, thank
That's
you.
right.
That's so kind.
Wisconsin.
We'll have to make individual deals with Wisconsin.
Premium price on all of those flowers. So, yeah.
Now, the reason I was saying about London, Gary, is that you are in the UK, but I don't hear an English accent. So where are you from originally?
Well, I grew up in the States. I mean, obviously, I've been living here for about 22 years, but I grew up in New Jersey, just across the Hudson from Manhattan. And then I lived in New York for a while. And then I lived in Los Angeles for several years. So I moved here in 1996. And I mean, friends tell me my sort of way of pronouncing some words and just general kind of, speech has changed a bit. But I don't feel I've got an English accent. I mean, some people have called it mid-Atlantic. So
well, it's very sophisticated for us Wisconsin Polacks, so we appreciate it.
Well, I'm a New Jersey Polak and Irish.
Hey, all right.
Believe me, it's not. I mean, I think often when I sort of just talk and I'm not self-conscious about it, you can hear the Jersey accent come in there. So.
A little bit, and we want to talk. Starting out with, growing up in New Jersey, and growing up in the middle of the 20th century. How did you get into this stuff? Like, what was your introduction? Did something happen to you? Did you have an experience?
What made it so weird?
To you? Did your mom drop you on your head? Like what happened?
I don't know if we have enough time to go into all of them, but no, I mean. How I got interested in what I'm writing about, which is, I guess you can call it the Western esoteric tradition, it started in 1975, and that's when I was a musician. Then I was playing in Blondie. But before Blondie became very, very famous. This is sort of the pre-punk days. It wasn't called punk rock yet, but this was in New York. And I was living with Debbie Harry and Chris Stein in this sort of dilapidated kind of loft space on the Bowery. And this was a block away from the big club, CBGB, the bar, where people like the Ramones and Patti Smith and Talking Heads and television and, all of that were becoming known there. And they had a kind of kitschy, fun interest in kind of the occult and, Satanism, and they'd have, sort of pentagrams and candles and upside down crosses and, it was more sort of a aesthetic, not a real kind of serious pursuit of it. And I hadn't been interested in that sort of thing. And then it also, in this loft space, it was 3 floors. It was it's still there actually. It's one of the few buildings on the Bowery that hasn't got gentrified and turned into some, overpriced hotel or apartment complex. Right. But this flamboyant, wild artist who was very much into Aleister Crowley's tarot. He had one of the Thoth tarot decks that at the time were still fairly rare, and he had one of those, and he did these sort of paintings, these big paintings, sort of based on those, and he would do impromptu tarot readings. And there were also there was sort of like this kind of cultural debris from the previous generation, a lot of books from the 60s and the counterculture and things of that sort. And there was a big occult revival in the 1960s. My first book, Turn Off Your Mind, is about the occult revival of the 1960s. And I started reading stuff by Crowley and about Crowley, but the book that really made the big impact on me and pretty much set me on the road to what I'm doing now is a book that was simply called The Occult, and that was by a British author named Colin Wilson, who died a few years ago. And it was Wilson wrote quite a bit, and actually, I much later on, I wrote a book about him. It was called Beyond the Robot: Life and Work of Colin Wilson. But in The Occult, it wasn't a collection of ghost stories or sort of spells or that kind of thing. He took it seriously, and he was trying to understand it in terms of philosophy and also in psychology, and in terms of a kind of philosophy of consciousness. And it was through reading that book and getting very interested at the time in it was, if you were interested in sort of the occult and the paranormal, the mid 70s to the late 70s, early 80s was actually a classic time, because there was a great many books, both new stuff coming out and then a lot of cheap reprints. So at that time in New York, there used to be a great bookshop called Weiser's that was over in kind of the East Village. But then all of the main sort of bookshops would have these sort of occult sections, and a lot of the stuff were discounted. So it was old books from, say, the 19th century or the early 20th century that were out of copyright and could be, reprinted cheaply. So you found all this kind of stuff. So it was a fantastic time. And I just, what started out as a naive kind of enthusiasm over the many years became, I guess, more or less kind of serious study of it.
Well, a couple of things there that you got me. First of all, number one, when we think about Satanism as an aesthetic, we always think about the early 1980s, like hair metal, that kind of thing. Everything from Ozzy's Mr. Crowley to like Motley Crue having like on their Shout at the Devil album, like a satanic altar in their album art. So it's funny, that's just another way you guys were trend setting in that, using the occult as an aesthetic in the new wave movement. And when you guys were working together, did you have any idea that it was going to have such a big impact on art?
It really wasn't something that was kind of part of the Blondie thing. It was something that Debbie and Chris it was kind of just stuff that was around, there's people just have lots of weird kind of stuff. I mean, it was just sort of part of a general kind of cultural kind of bric-a-brac that they had. So, I mean, around the same time, like this loft space, in a book I wrote called New York Rocker, My Life in the Blank Generation, I talk about my years with Blondie and then subsequently with my own band and then playing with Iggy Pop. But in this space, it was sort of, you'd have some of Chris's photographs, and then maybe you'd have a pentagram somewhere. Then there was the Velvet Underground album cover, and then, some painting. So it wasn't like a central thing. And in the Blondie kind of, image, it really wasn't part of it. I mean, later on, I think Debbie and Chris got it because they became friends with H.R. Giger, the fellow who did the sets for Alien, and he's very much into, it's kind of a cult, sort of dark fantasy kind of thing. I mean, the one thing that was a Blondie product was my song, I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear, which was about the sort of kind of telepathic experiences I was having with my girlfriend at the time, when we would wind up sort of being in each other's dreams, or synchronicities would happen. We'd call each other when the other was just about to call the other one, and so on and so on. So I did a song about that. But it became sort of, it really wasn't sort of part of the thing, in the sense that, like in the 60s, and as you say, in the 80s, you did have a lot of bands that were kind of using a lot of occult imagery, or it was part of the image. But the 70s thing in New York was kind of reaction against a lot of, the prior sort of ways of doing. So it was something that, it was more like my own kind of thing. It wasn't, although I have to say, when I left Blondie, I started my own band. It was called The Know, KNOW, and that was taken from my interest in Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is one of the sort of ancient religions or spiritual teachings that forms part of the root of what we call the Western esoteric tradition. And gnosis in Greek means knowledge. And Gnosticism is basically a kind of spiritual belief that was based on one having one's own immediate kind of experience of this other planes, whatever you want to call them, the religious mystical experience, rather than taking things on faith and on dogma. So, I mean,
we talked about the mystery religions.
I'm saying my own kind of trajectory, it was something that became more kind of, but I personally myself, I never got into the real kind of loud, kind of explicit, expression of it that you get in the heavy metal bands. It was all kind of muted for myself. But I think what happened with that was that at the end of the 60s, you see bands like Black Sabbath and others, they kind of take that aspect of the occult, the kind of dark, more satanic or Luciferian, whatever you want to call it, and that became one kind of genre. And then sort of the lighter, more, I don't know, meditative sorts of things, that went a different direction. So.
Sure. Well, can we get one example of your? It sounds like you and your girlfriend did have Radar Love. You wrote a song about it. Like what was one example that you guys had?
Oh, I mean, it's such a long time ago. It's 40 years ago. So I mean, it was just that sort of thing where we would, find out that we had a similar dream, or we would. Well, back then, this is before cell phones and all this kind of thing, or the internet, and so you had to sort of figure out a way to get free calls, and there was a way that we figured out using a phone box that was outside the hotel when I was first staying here. As I'm saying, or when we were on tour, that was the sort of thing. We were the first tour, the tour of the States. We were opening for Iggy Pop, Blondie, and it was during that tour that it would just. As I said, I can't remember a specific kind of thing, but it was that general kind of thing where you're about to call the person and then they're calling you, or something along those lines. So I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but it is like 40 years ago.
Yeah, that's okay. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions that were written into us, and some of the things have kind of come up already that people had questions about. So my friend and fellow Chicago Mothman investigator, Jack Blue, had a question about occult symbology in rock and roll, either then or now. And, whether, because there are certainly fringes that say, there is some kind of occult underground. There's some, like the Illuminati or something that is trying to actively manifest things, and that's the reason for the symbology, or is it just like kind of bric-a-brac, as you were saying, just kind of trappings of like a revolutionary spirit of going against the old. I mean, what do you think? Is there any reality?
I'm personally, I'm not, I don't think there's an Illuminati in the way that, you hear a lot about it or see a lot about it on the net. And I know, and I have to say, I'm not, I'm pretty much out of touch with contemporary pop music and all that. Although, in a book I did about Crowley called Aleister Crowley, Magic, Rock and Roll, and the Wickedest Man in the World, there's a good chapter on the end of the book about sort of Crowley's ongoing career as a kind of rock and roll icon, and then he's also been picked up by rap, Jay-Z and people like that, and rap singers. And I don't know. I personally don't think there's any kind of real secret cabal of rock and roll, or whatever, entertainers, celebrities, and other people, politicians and bankers and all that. But they're in that world. I think there's a real interest in symbols of power and symbols of being exclusive and sort of the elite and that kind of thing. My own experiences when I was in the music world is the couple people that I knew or had met that expressed a real interest in it. It was more, a little bit more than faddish, but not particularly deep. And when they really sort of serious study is something that interests them, and so they read. There's a story I tell in my book New York Rocker about basically getting asked to leave David Bowie's loft space in Midtown Manhattan sometime in 1980 because we had a disagreement about Colin Wilson, and again, he was a very popular British writer. And he wasn't somebody I hung out with all the time, Bowie, but I somehow got invited to some kind of gathering at this place where he was holding court, and there was a lull in the conversation, and someone mentioned that somehow Bowie started talking about his interest in the occult or something like that. And someone mentioned that I knew all about it because I read Colin Wilson, because Wilson, wrote, and by this time I was sort of a real devotee of his books and was reading everything about it. And Bowie started going on about how Wilson was the head of a coven somewhere in Cornwall. and how he was trying to manifest sort of, the spirits of Nazis and all this kind of, off the wall weird stuff. And I just said, well, David, actually, it's not quite like that. And then he kept going on and on. And I kept sort of just, sort of gently just saying, well, it's not quite like that. And then eventually his two female bodyguards, who were like Bambi and Thumper, and I forget which Bond film, I think it's Never Say Never Again, or one of those Bond films, where they, they came and escorted me out of the place. But the funny thing is that subsequently I came to understand why he was saying those things, because I know the book he was reading at the time was a book by Wilson called Mysteries, and actually Wilson tells the story of. Again, it's not a coven, so Bowie got things all mixed up. But he tells the story of this Cambridge sort of archaeologist, man named T.C. Lethbridge, who in his sort of later life he became very deeply interested in the paranormal and witchcraft, and he was studying it in Cornwall and so on and so on. And so I can't go into the details, but basically, Bowie had mixed up what Wilson was writing about this guy Lethbridge and sort of just got it into this kind of mishmash. So, I mean, I think a lot of these people they pick up on it, because it's something that they can use. I mean, they're artists, so they can use it for a while, and then it loses its kind of interest. And
it's just kind of a trendy, iconoclastic thing.
I would think
it's a symbol of being a rebel.
And again, like if Madonna is into Kabbalah, that's great, but there's thousands of other people who've been into Kabbalah for years and years and years. Right. So I mean, the reason that we know about it with her because she's a celebrity, and good if that means that other people will get interested in it, that's good too. But I'm not trying to sort of minimize their sort of seriousness about it, but oftentimes it's something that's actually quite just kind of something that they've got into because it interests them at the time.
Right, and we just give them too much gravitas because of their celebrity.
I think so, personally,
yeah.
Right. It's like Selena Gomez, like saying she's into the occult because she does hot yoga.
Well, that's one of the other things. I don't know. Are the Jonas Brothers? Are they still around? Do they still do anything? But they one of. Well, I'm just saying. When I did this book on Crowley, one of the things that came up and was that one of them was into Crowley, or he was wearing a kind of Crowley T-shirt, and. I just know them because my sons, when they were young, they used to watch their TV show on the Disney Channel or something. And I thought, okay, if you've got guys on the Disney Channel that are into Crowley, I mean, he can't be really that scary anymore,
Right.
Well, that was the power of that you really hit the nail on the head there, where people talk about the Illuminati, and obviously Jay-Z's a lizard person, and I'm glad you said that David Bowie had that Colin Wilson thing mixed up, because now we know that Bowie wasn't a lizard person, because lizard people wouldn't get that wrong.
Oh, there you go. That's the test. I'll have to remember that now.
It's the power, the power of the symbols to scare parents. It's the power of the pentagram that scares Midwestern, minivan driving mothers is what made it, scary. It's the idea that I remember Alison, our mother, when in 8th grade, I asked her to buy Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden. And that's just a song about the movie Omen 2, not even one of the good Omen movies. Right. But, the guy at the music store was like, well, there's a lot of great guitar playing on the album or whatever. And she's like, okay. But I mean, it's that idea of using the symbology and that's a magical power, not necessarily a magical power, but that's a power in its own right.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, if you know what you're doing, or oftentimes you just throw it up there and it has the effect anyway. But no, I mean, that's one of the things people can use these things. They don't necessarily have to be serious devotees or really know too much about them, but they know it can have an effect. Just like anything that's powerful, you could use it. You don't have to know, the ingredients for it or how to make it. If you know how to turn it on and it works. So, I guess, and again, that's one of the things I would say. That's one of the reasons why there's this kind of melange of the occult, Nazism, weird kind of horror fiction, or I don't know, apocalyptic kind of milieu, and these things all kind of blend together into a kind of general kind of weird death, destruction, romanticism kind of thing. And it's because they generate a very, I mean, the funny thing that nobody ever picks up on the hammer and sickle. There's not too many bands that do a kind of Soviet, and again, because that symbology is very secular. It's nothing really mystical. It's about it's the farmer, the plowman, and the sort of the worker.
Right.
Whereas the swastika is some weird thing.
The wizard's not in there.
It's some strange thing that goes back, ancient history. It's the Nazis didn't invent the swastika, and sometimes it's an ancient symbol, and funny thing, you can imagine there must have been some people around the time when Hitler had appropriated the symbol and was, using it a lot, where they were saying, no, this is we can't let this symbol be taken over by, this evil force, because it's a good one, so you can imagine people trying to sort of convince people that the swastika wasn't bad, being possible to do it today.
Right. Well, talk a little bit more about that misappropriation of symbols or reassignment, because, I think maybe a lot of people don't know about the true origins of the swastika. And, maybe you can also point to, because you have that new book coming out, Dark Star Rising, which I'm really excited, because it addresses this kind of weird period that we're going through now where anything can happen, it feels like anyway. And, so if you could address the swastika and maybe talk about any symbols that you see or any developments you see going at the direction of being misappropriated.
Well, I mean, it's, the swastika is ancient. It just turns up in all ancient cultures. It turns up in ancient India and turns up in North American Indian as well. So it's just something, whether it's a sun wheel or, there's a variety of different attempts to say exactly what it is and what its origin was, but just the sense that it's something that's been involved in many, cultures around the world for a long time, and it's precisely because of that I think its road to Hitler was through one of the Guido van Leest, or this magazine. He was this Austrian, sort of theosophist, but he took some ideas of Madame Blavatsky's theosophy into very racial and white supremacist and Aryan. That was the other thing too. This was, the whole Aryan, the idea of Aryan man and all of that. That's something that started up in the late 19th, or really got going then into the 20th century, and the whole racial idea. That was another thing that fed. The kind of Nazis. Obviously, it was part of the Nazi rise, but it was also something that was in the air. They didn't have a monopoly on that, put it that way. That was something that was kind of in the cultural mix at the time. But the one I write about in Dark Star Rising, Dark Star Rising: Magic and Power in the Age of Trump, is Pepe the Frog. So I don't know if you or your listeners are aware of Pepe,
right
but it's just kind of. All right, so
I know who Pepe the Frog is.
Started out as this innocuous, amphibian slacker, and then became kind of the mascot of the alt-right. And the reason I did the book, it's not really inspiration, it's not quite the right word, but what had happened is that, it'll take a bit of explaining, but what had happened is that, if you remember, after Trump's election, there's a group called the National Policy Institute, and this is a very innocuous name for an organization that it seems very much like a white supremacist sort of far right group, and it's led by Richard Spencer, who's the fellow who sort of coined the alt right and so on. And if you remember,
he's the guy that got punched in that video, right?
He got punched, yes. And Pepe didn't protect him. He was actually wearing a Pepe badge at the time, and it didn't protect him from the Antifa. Great. But what had happened is that they had their annual meeting shortly after Trump's election, and at the beginning of it, Spencer declaimed to the crowd that we made this possible, we willed this to happen, we dreamed Trump into the presidency, and so on and so on and so on. And this got and they responded with the Hitler salutes or Roman salutes, whatever you want to call them, and so on and so on. And this got picked up by a fellow named Harvey Bishop, who writes about New Thought, New Thought and sort of mental science and that kind of thing. And in his blog, he said, "Oh, it looks like the alt-right are starting to use sort of, mental science tactics in order to, push their politics. And what he meant by that is that the whole idea of new thought and mental science and positive thinking is that, through positive thinking, through, a very really intense and concentrated focusing of your mind and your imagination very vividly on what you want to happen, it will take place. And, this goes back to the mid 19th century with Christian Science and things of that sort, and
that's the secret.
Yeah, I'm saying yes. Most recently, it got a new lease on life through the well-known Secret and all of that. But it seemed to be that these bad people or the dark side, was using these sorts of tactics, and so I was interested in that, and then. What the story seemed to be was that they seemed to be using a kind of darker or more aggressive variant of kind of new thought, which we call chaos magic. Now, what's chaos magic? Chaos magic is basically good old magic, but you don't stick to the traditional, sigils and signs and apparatus and all that, the magical circle and the weapons and the usual kind of ceremony and ritual. You basically make use of whatever's at hand. It's in some ways, it's on the same principle as sort of found art. When someone finds something in the street, they pick it up and they put it in a box or on a pedestal, and suddenly it's an art object or something like that. So same
right.
Same kind of thing with magic. So these all different sorts of things you can use, and it frees you up, and it's about your own creativity and your own sort of imagination and your own ingenuity and so on. And in addition to that, that kind of practice, I think it has its roots in the late 70s and then into the 80s, but then the traditional sort of medium in which the magician works is the will and the imagination. And this was the old kind of technique of the new thought. You focus on, what you want to make happen very vividly in your mind, and you project that out into the world and so on. But in the new techno world, the internet has become kind of this new medium in which these things can take place. So if you kind of think of the internet as an exteriorized imagination, and that's how I tend to think of it. So it's kind of the collective exteriorized imagination now. And it's constant, or whatever, it's not even whatever you want to call that world now, the cyber world or whatever, but it's something that's constant. It's all the time. And
we're all plugged in all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of the background. And so what seemed to the steps that kind of led to Spencer claiming that the alt-right had wished or willed Trump into office was that there were these kind of online gaming kind of addicts, and they were all plugged into 4chan. And if you know what 4chan is, this kind of chat space or whatever, a board space and kind of
basement
thing,
of the internet.
And they were posting, people get into their nerdy, kind of interests and all that sort of thing. And what seemed to be happening is that there was something called Bane posting. There was a thread about the character Bane from Dark Knight Rises.
Yeah.
And some people really into this, and they kept posting the opening kind of scene when he's on the plane, and it's ostensibly he's being transported somewhere, but actually he's in charge and he's in control and determining everything and so on and so on. And what they started to see, and it sounds really strange and morbid, was that soon after, or not too long after they started this thread, this is when you had the tragic Germanwings flight that crashed in the Alps, and this is when the pilot, flew the plane, crashed on purpose, and they started to see all these kind of similarities, sort of coincidences to the scene from the film that they were posting. And so there's one of the towns that was near where the crash took place was called Bane, and one of the investigators of the crash, his name was Bruce Robin, and obviously Bruce Wayne is Batman's, and Robin's his sidekick.
Wayne, right?
And then the pilot crashed the plane on purpose, and so on and so on. So they started thinking, wow, are we making this happen?
Ooh.
is by posting all this stuff on the net, are we starting to affect reality? So somehow is the internet, this alternate reality of the internet, starting to affect real reality? And it's on the same principle. People started calling this synchromysticism, but it's on the same principle as Jung's ideas of synchronicity, which is fundamentally when something happening in your mind and something happening in the outer world, there's a directly, deeply meaningful, connection between them, and you think, oh my God, it's just one of these fantastical, meaningful coincidences. And so, if you think of it this way, what, unlike Vegas, what happens in the mind doesn't stay there. So, likewise for the internet, what happens on the internet doesn't stay there. So these people are starting to think that somehow by posting these things, they were affecting the outer world in the same way that somehow, in some way, either the mind or some way, these synchronicities happen. And so the next step is, okay, can we do this on purpose? If this just happened by chance, we just discovered that this was taking place. Now, can we use this for some way? And I guess this is where Pepe hops into the picture, as it were, is that he got appropriated by the alt-right and pro-Trump people and a variety of other kind of whatever you want to call it, these kind of cyber guerrillas on the internet. And from being a kind of innocuous, just kind of cartoon character, he started to become this kind of. They took him on as what in magic you would call a sigil. It's a symbol, an image that can become charged with sort of magical energy, with the magician's will and the magician's intention and his imagination. And their will and intention was to put Trump in the White House. And so they kept posting all of these Pepe, memes of Pepe, and it became known as meme magic. And so you kept sort of posting stuff on the internet, Pepe doing this, Pepe doing that, mostly Pepe, being associated with Trump, and he's part of the deplorables. If you remember that meme, that
they even gave Pepe the Trump,
and he's there, or he's with him and all that. And so the idea was that through doing this, and somehow we were going to affect the collective consciousness, the collective imagination, and we would, and see, and the other side of that, it gets very strange, because the other side of that is, in a way, so if you're having the online world, let's say, affecting the real world, but then Trump himself is a kind of unreal character who's stepping into reality, because he started, he was for years a reality television figure. So there's it gets all these kind of things could have tie into each other.
Yeah.
And so the whole idea of post-truth and alternative fact and the fascination we have with reality television. I mean, what's the most popular thing on television today? Reality, right?
So-called.
Right. It's singing shows and people living in together. It's The Bachelor, where we are synthesizing love on television.
It's there's a program here called Gogglebox, and it's a television program about people watching television. And what they watch on television is other real life people on television shows. So there's it's like this mirror, this kind of mirror and mirror and mirror and mirror. It's like the represented world becomes more and more, re-represented and all that. And it seems to be this kind of exchange. And so in some ways, it's the same kind of exchange that we're talking about between the mind and reality, between the internet and reality. Now it's between reality and television, where, the barrier that at one point was a bit more firm and solid has become very porous, permeable, and these different, whatever you want to call them, levels of I don't know what you want to call it, kinds of reality, they seem to be slipping in and out of each other, and it's happening in the States with Trump and that, and part of the book, it led to a book I'm researching now, is that it's been happening in Russia for a longer time. Putin had in place a kind of official reality that he was in control of, through the media and all that for, a very, very long time.
That was always the thing about the Russian media, even back in the Soviet days, like the name of the paper was Pravda, right? The truth. And that was the government-run paper is going to tell you the truth. Now, one more question, Gary, about symbology. And this is just something I was thinking about as you were talking. There's a book by a guy named Chuck Palahniuk the guy who wrote Fight Club, he wrote a book called Lullaby. And the idea behind Lullaby is that, we take all these ancient, he was looking at like toilet paper that had these like sacred ancient Native American symbols on them. And he just says how we, appropriate, as time goes on and cultures change, you appropriate the things of the old, and then you kind of make it like you were talking about in your loft with the Satanism and the kitschiness and things like that. You just put it up. He's like, hey, that's a cool poster. It's like how, Allison used to draw anarchy symbols on things, right?
My name does start with A, so it's perfect to write your name with the anarchy symbol.
Well, I mean, I think you're right. It's just kind of it's kind of like a cultural. Well, the kind of like the way I tend to see it is that this kind of postmodern world we're in now, where it's all these images, it's all these symbols, right, and they're all displaced. You can pick them up and put them down anywhere. It's kind of like, if you think of like a river at the sort of, it silts up over time, and the delta extends. For all the silt that's collected by the river going, to the sea, it creates this delta that's made up all the silt. And that's kind of like where we are now. Like all this kind of stuff is kind of just backed up and is spreading out around us, and we can kind of pick and choose. And it's, it's to remember correctly, to remember well. And is something I think is also, increasingly becoming a lost art.
As a student of the tradition, though, is there anything in, of the Western esoteric tradition, is there any symbol you've seen in any kind of like on a wallpaper or even in some kind of innocuous thing that you were like, oh my God, I can't believe they used the death symbol for this?
You see, I mean, there's a lot of fashion, occult. I don't know if it's in the States, but here in London, there is a kind of occult fashion in, different designers and things like that. The Tree of Life or zodiacal signs and the eye in the pyramid, all this kind of stuff. It gets picked up, and again, precisely because we were talking about before, celebrities doing it, and music people or whatever, they do it. And so that fellow Jay-Z had his own line of clothing, I think, that had all these kind of Illuminati images on it and stuff like that. So it kind of, in some ways, it's sort of, oh my God, it's nothing sacred.
Yeah, but then
the truth is no. Yes, nothing is sacred, because nothing escapes that kind of thing. I mean, I tell you something. I was surprised at not seeing this Easter, because it fell on April Fool's Day. I thought I would see a lot of images of kind of, Christ saying, just fooling,
I really am dead.
I mean, I'm sorry I thought that, but I thought, I'm sure there's going to be something like that, but I was surprised I didn't see it or something like that.
You could have started a meme, Gary. You could have started that meme.
I know, but I didn't want to. I know, because I try to keep something sacred. I mean, not necessarily, Christian iconography, which I don't have anything against, and but it's just that, and and each generation kind of does that. The things that frightened or an earlier generation considered really important, the next generation thinks, oh my God, what were they all worked up about? And I think that's true in general of our kind of postmodern time. If you the kinds of the sort of existential questions that really concerned, say, the existentialists in the 1940s and 50s and all that, what's the meaning of life and the burden of freedom and all that. It's kind of like, oh, that's no biggie. It's like no big deal today. We kind of live in the whatever kind of, and that, the chickens are coming home to roost, because that kind of sense of nothing really matters has allowed for what's taking place in the world in politics. It's allowed. Okay, if that's the case, then there's nothing to stop cynical people who can take advantage of that situation and use it for their own purposes. And so,
to go back to the Dark Knight real quick, Gary, just before you get to the next question, I like that you brought that up at the end, the idea that nothing matters, because that's the message of before the whole Bane movie or whatever. There's a movie about the Joker, and Michael Caine as Alfred has that long speech about how they were trying to hunt that guy, and some men just want to watch the world burn. And that seems like that's what's behind a lot of the political movements now.
No, I think you're right, and I think there's, as you say it, there are resentment and desires, whatever you want to call it, angers at work that are not they're not going to be amenable to any kind of rationalization, rational understanding, or be open to reason and try to argue it out. And again, if you look at everyone knows that Trump lies. Everyone knows that there's a very interesting essay that I referred to in the book about Trump and bullshit. And the difference between a liar and a bullshit. A liar wants to convince you of something, and he's afraid if he's found out. And he'll be afraid if you find out the truth. The bullshitter doesn't care if you find out the truth or not. He wants to impress right then and there when he's talking. And so Trump doesn't care. And so all these attempts to sort of show, oh, he's lying, or, he has no integrity and he's not honest, that doesn't matter to him. And again, that's because what you're saying, these things don't matter anymore. We've kind of come to the realization that they're just not as unassailable, as we thought they were. And yeah, the whole idea that, there are some minds and psyches out there that they don't necessarily have any rational aim in mind. They just want to cause mayhem and cause chaos and destruction. And that's in some ways tying into a kind of apocalyptic is a bit overused word, but there is a kind of sensibility of that where I do feel there's a hovering expectancy of something is going to happen.
Like some terrible tragedy, like a death wish.
Either some climate related thing or some political kind of thing or something like that. And in the book I say that, a lot of people have been waiting for the singularity, and I think Trump is the singularity. Trump's the singularity that's changed everything. It's completely, no one expected it, and now, as I said, the whole idea of truth and reality and everything else that we built a kind of stable, world order on has become, very unstable now.
Well, Gary, help us.
And,
how
well, I am doing what I can. I'm doing what I can.
How do we? How do we get to?
I think we need to
practical?
understand. I think we need to understand the situation. It sounds pessimistic, but I think it's better if we understand the situation, because then we know what we have to do. And it gets back to the imagination. If it is true in any way that this kind of new thought, mental science, power, positive thinking, chaos magic, whatever you want, if in any way, the mind can directly influence reality, and some of the great minds of the Western culture have said that as much. Yeats said, be careful of what, Yeats said, what is thought in the imagination will work itself out in the, in your everyday life. And Goethe, be careful what you wish for, you'll get it in middle age. And, there's all these kinds of warnings about, it sounds like, from our scientific point of view, the most ridiculous kind of thing. If only the world was that easy, whatever I thought about and wanted to happen would happen. We all know it's not like that in that way. But there does seem to be, okay, if you step out of that kind of certainty and then you look at a variety of different philosophies and so on, there does seem to be some way in which, well, why is there all these warnings about this? If it's something that, it's impossible. And, there's all different ways. I mean, I think this is why in the end of my book, Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, and that's part of the knowledge of the imagination, knowing that it isn't just in your head. It's something,
and there's a responsibility to it.
There's a responsibility for it. Yes, I agree, and I think there is something that we have to look at that, because the general idea is that, okay, well, if we've been burdened by this kind of reductive, constrained scientific way of looking at things, then what we need is a lot more imagination. But we don't need, the answer to that isn't anything goes. From kind of no imagination to nothing but imagination, we'll put it that sense of anything goes. That's just a pendulum swing from one side to the other.
Right. And that's kind of what we've seen happening. And, so I'm interested in where we go from here. Cause, in your books, you talked about cosmic consciousness. You talked about this responsibility of the imagination. You talked about, the duality of the two human needs, the quantitative and the qualitative, how do we get to that wholeness, and how do we move forward in responsibility? What would you say?
That was a good question. So a lot of brilliant men and women have been working on that for a long time, and there isn't one. I think there's a general trend. I think the general idea is to somehow integrate these two sides of ourselves, which are, both of them are absolutely necessary. And that's what I mean. That's why we tend to swing from one to the other, and there are occasional brief times when the two are kind of together at one. The pendulum is in the middle, and it's not stopped, but it somehow can maintain that middle point. And
right, it's like integrated.
Sorry,
integrated. To integrate the two.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think that, how should we say? There's no secret of what to do. We have a whole tradition about this. It's understanding that that's what that tradition is about, I would say, and that's one of the things I tried to in my book, Secret Teachers of the Western World. I use the kind of lens of split brain psychology as it's been rebooted by Ian McGilchrist in this absolutely marvelous book called The Master and His Emissary, where he takes the whole idea of the differences between the right and left brain, which had sort of fallen out of favor from most mainstream neuroscientists, and he restarts it, but in a different way. It's not that they necessarily do different things; it's how they do them, and they do them in very different ways. The brains, both sides of the brain, do mostly the same things, but how they do it is very different. And we've been mostly focused on how the left brain operates, which is about analyzing things and getting very explicit knowledge. And breaking things up into bits and pieces so that we can manipulate them and control them. We need to be able to do that because that's how we survive. But the other side is about a more holistic, a fuzzy kind of unifying perception of things, where it's felt and it can't be explicitly described in the same way that you can explicitly describe kind of left brain knowledge, but it's that right brain kind of way of, or it's when the two come together. Really, that's when you really have the kind of moments of cosmic consciousness, let's say, or moments of wakefulness, or moments of more vivid life and all that. And we have many traditions about that. I think at this point it's helpful to kind of understand what some of the theory behind it might be, in terms of, okay, yes, I can understand that in terms of my actual the psychology of human psychology, and I don't know. I mean, perhaps one of the philosophers that's been very influential in my work is a fellow named Jean Gebser, who was born in Germany in the early 20th century, and then he later basically escaping from the Nazis and all that, wound up in Switzerland. And he wrote a fantastic book called The Ever-Present Origin, which is one of the most magisterial works of trying to understand the entirety of sort of the human consciousness, from the earliest sort of proto-human beginnings to for him contemporary time. He died in the early 70s. But he talks about how what has been happening in the West, say, throughout the 20th century, and increasing and becoming more and more the case, is that we're going through what he calls the breakdown of the mental rational structure of consciousness. And this has been sort of the structure of consciousness that's been dominant with us, say, since going back to the Greeks, this rational, analytical, leading to the scientific and all that. And, he has no illusions about the necessity and the value and the importance of all that. But much in the same way that McGilchrist sees that we've, in some ways, overemphasized that to the exclusion of this other, more integrated view. He talks about the next structure of consciousness, which we can be heading into, there's no guarantee, is what he calls the integral structure. But we have to go through this process of the breakup of the dominant one now. And it strikes me that the whole postmodernism, deconstructionism, post-truth, alternative fact, the ambiguity about reality, the different ways in which the Western scientific sort of mainstream intellectual tradition has been kind of criticized within itself, and then from people outside, even myself, even people interested in the occult and all that, that we have quite a bit of problems with that and all that. So I think that is what's happening now, and in a way you sort of have to go through this kind of dark night of the soul to a certain extent at this period. But there's no guarantees, and it's not a picnic. And I think each of us has to work very hard in order to kind of understand what's happening, and then in all different ways to try and find some way to experience this more integral kind of, because at the same time, I think it happens to us. We do experience this. Again, it's something that it's not something necessarily we have to work meditating 6 hours a day in order to achieve. It's something that is part of our experience now, except that we're not aware that that's what it is.
Right. Yeah. And we're experiencing this breakdown right now, as you said. And so the potential is to have a glorious new dawn. And so I have a
golden dawn, you might say.
Yes, a golden dawn. That's right.
There you go.
Good one, Mike. So I have a question from para-anthropologist Dr. Jack Hunter. He's the author of the upcoming book, Engaging the Anomalous, published by our friend Robbie Graham's August Night Books. And he asks, how can an awareness and understanding of esoteric philosophy aid us in tackling the eco-crisis? And he said, does Western esoteric philosophy have a practical application in this regard?
Well, there's two ways to answer that question. I mean, not all. There isn't one esoteric philosophy. It's made up of it's a kind of a body of knowledge, traditions of different backgrounds. There's different ones have different sort of ideas about our relationship to nature. I mean, there's some that have a very sort of nature mysticism, or the whole notion that we somehow participate with the outer world. We're not completely set off from it. But others have a more strict kind of, the human spirit is something different than the natural world. We're not necessarily antagonistic to it, but there's some part of us that can't be explained or accommodated purely, through natural kinds of means. So, but then again, there's the whole idea like what is nature? I mean, I would think most esotericists accept the idea of a kind of a living nature as opposed to the mechanical view of it, let's say, like that is dominant from Newton on. Yes, there's a kind. Yes, Descartes and yeah. I mean, there's nature is something that it will respond. We have a participatory relationship with it and a responsive relationship with it. So, and this is something that I do look at in Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, and ways in which the imagination itself is a way in which we can participate. Become aware of our participatory relationship to the natural world, and how we can actually feel that more vividly. So, but I do think it is part of the sort of spiritual philosophy, and this is something that I talk about in another book called Caretakers of the Cosmos, which is about our responsibility to the natural world and the broader cosmos, and in that sense is that if you're tending the garden, you're not a flower in it. You have to be a kind of in a meta position to be able to take care of the garden. You can't be one of the flowers in it, but you tend them, you take care of them, you revere them, and they're beautiful and all that, and you know how important they are. But you have to somehow have some separation. The same situation is with children. If you're taking care of your children, you can't be a child yourself. So you have to have a kind of position of responsibility, which I would say necessitates a certain distance from. So we can't be completely embedded in nature. And I think there is something in us that's something more, for sake of a better word. It's kind of, you call it the spiritual, whatever you want to call it. There's something that we're aware that we're occupants of two worlds, inhabitants of two worlds. There's the natural world, the cosmic world that we're part of, but there's also this inner world. And that's one of the meanings of the esoteric tradition. Esoteric means inner. And it's inner in the sense it's the inner teachings of the great religions, like Gnosticism is sort of inner Christianity, and Kabbalah is kind of inner Judaism and things of that sort. But there's also the our own inner world, our own interior area. And as I say in Lost Knowledge of the Imagination and other books, many people who have gone into that interior, taken that journey, they've discovered an entire universe inside themselves. In the sense that, it's as Jung talks about when he in his Red Book, when he talks about he went through this crisis after his falling out with Freud, and he felt that he was going mad.
He couldn't stop thinking about sex.
Well, I think he had a hard time stopping thinking about that, whether he was involved with Freud or not. But he sort of let himself go once, and let himself get carried away by these fantasies that he was keep trying to fend off for fear he was going mad, and that he discovered by doing that he had somehow entered this world that existed inside him, what we would say inside his own mind.
Oh yeah, and through hypnagogia, right?
Wait. I'm sorry.
Hypnagogia. You talked about that as well.
Oh yeah, this is something that he practiced, and that is this is a good practice, but I'll get to that one second. The other thing I'm going to say is that he realized there was a whole inner terrain, a whole inner geography, and also inhabitants of this world that had nothing to do with him. And he meets this kind of wise old man that was called Philemon, who became this kind of inner guru for him. And he said, your mistake is that you think your thoughts are your own. But your thoughts are like the flowers and the animals in the forest. You go out into the forest, you're sharing the forest with them. That they're not yours. Just like this inner forest you've entered, the beings and terrain and flora and fauna you encounter, they're not just subjectively yours that you're making. You are sharing it with them. And so Jung came to understand that there were living intelligences inside his own mind, which sounds like he was crazy and all that. But yeah, hypnagogia is this way in which that's one practice that we can actually, anyone can do this, to become aware of this inner world and watch it at work and watch its processes. And hypnagogia is basically it's this condition of being in between sleep and waking. So it happens 2 times a day, when you're going to sleep at night, when you're waking up in the morning. And there are different methods of being able to maintain that in-between state. And if you can't do that, you can sort of watch dreams take place, but you're still wide awake, and you're still aware of your surroundings. You're aware that you're in the room, which it makes it different than a dream, because if you're in a dream, you're completely immersed in the dream. And then you often forget, you don't know it's a dream, unless you're lucky enough to have a lucid dream in which you wake up within it and you're aware that you're dreaming. But hypnagogia is the other way around, whereas lucid dreaming is you're awake while you're dreaming, and hypnagogia, you're dreaming while you're awake.
Yeah.
So you can stay awake, but you can watch these visions take place before you. And Jung was someone who was very good at that. Swedenborg, Rudolf Steiner, P.D. Uspensky. It's actually essential. It goes under different names, but that's the kind of clinical name of it. But it's essential practice in all of these kind of mystical occult philosophies. It's a way of actually entering into this inner world.
Yeah, I wonder if Edgar Cayce, might have been another one.
Oh, he may very well. Yeah, I mean, he went into trance states and things of that sort. So
Fred Fogarty of HawaiiParacon.com, he asks, regarding thought forms, what is the difference between manifesting something using the power of imagination versus the falseness of priming? Priming being that psychological phenomenon where having been exposed to a word or idea, it influences our experiences later. So how can we know the difference between manifesting and just, being primed for something?
Oh, God, I don't know. Tell you the truth. I don't know. I can only imagine the proof is in the the proof of the pudding's in the tasting. So if there is something that you want to happen and you follow the steps, I don't know. I haven't practiced a great deal of it myself, so I can't say whether from personal experience it works. But yeah, I mean, you might. Okay, are you saying you may think that you've want this thing to happen, and but you're psychologically
in Ghosts, for example, like people experience something strange, because Mike and I are both paranormal investigators. So, people will come to you, present with, stories of strange things that happen, but then they tend to lump everything into one basket then under that umbrella of strange experience. And then it makes it hard to piece out, well, was there any actual weirdness in there in the first place, or is it just somebody watching too many episodes of Ghost Adventures?
Oh yeah, well yeah. I mean, well, I guess I guess each case, you have to sort of keep that in mind and while you're sort of assessing its value. I know for myself, put it this way, I'm firmly convinced that I have had precognitive dreams. So I'm, I've noted them down I started, writing them down in books, reporting them in 1980. And from then the first few years I started experimenting with this, or observing it. I have quite a few notebooks full of them, and then gradually since then, over the years, every now and then I'll because I still have them. I don't know how they happen, but I do know it's a phenomenon that takes place.
Yeah, and so synchronicities as well.
Are they moments of great importance for you, or is it just like? Because I think I've had a couple of experiences.
No. It's just well. No, it's just something that I notice. It's never like it's never the winner at Aqueduct, something like that. It's never like I'm gonna. Although in some, in terms of my own, let's say, spiritual and psychological development, there have been ones that have been very meaningful like that. So they haven't been, I know, if I invest tomorrow in this stock, I'm going to make a lot of money. It's not like that. But I have had examples where I've kind of had a pre-echo of something that was about to happen, and it's allowed me to be aware in that moment, because I can think, oh my God, this is what I dreamt.
Yeah.
And in the dream, it led to an argument or some negative, outcome. But because I remembered having the dream, to put it in a strange way, remembering the dream woke me up for a moment while I was going through, the same happening that had happened in the dream, and I was able to sort of not get angry or something along those lines. That doesn't happen all the time, but that happens sometimes. But mostly it's inconsequential kind of things.
I think you're giving us, another practical thing that we can do here, which is journaling.
Oh, write down your dreams.
Journaling, like journal your dreams, journal your synchronicities, or any insights that come to you unbidden or even bidden.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and any synchronicities, any hunches that come true. I mean, things like that. I've had that, and
so it's like you're having that state then, where you have those two sides of the human needs, where you're letting your imagination run, and then you're also being more analytical about it, just writing it down.
Well, write it down, and it's there, and then
you can be analytical about it later too when you look back.
Well, it's also you can accumulate, a lot of material,
right?
And you can look over time, and then you can see. Well, I know science tells me that this can't happen, but it has. Here's the evidence for it. And unless you're going to say to yourself, "Well, I must be completely fooled by all of this," or or you can let Derren Brown explain it to you in terms of some, whatever, you've been manipulated. I just think, reality is such that these things happen, and so I'm going to say the next step from that is like, okay, how must reality be if indeed these things do take place? And so it seems to me like, our standard ideas about time, which are very serviceable in work, most of the time, they're not the absolute idea about time, and likewise about consciousness and all these kinds of things. So, allowing the experience allowing the anomaly to actually be an anomaly, and not to try to explain it away in terms of, what we think we know already. That extends the frontier of your knowledge and extends the frontier of your experience, and that's what it's about.
Well, and I tell you, if the people that are interested in any more about lucid dreaming, we have a whole episode about it. Episode 2, we go into some practical ways that you guys can lucidly dream, and we even have a song called Hypnagogia that's featured in that one. That's about that state between waking and dreaming. So, Gary, I want to thank you for your time. We're about to run out of time here, and I just had one more question for everybody. So, a lot of people listening to this podcast are not as deep into the occult and stuff like that, and that kind of esotericism as we are. I mean, we've talked about Colin Wilson before, but mostly in the form of space vampires, because when we discussed the death of Toby Hooper and wanted to talk about his influences. Yeah. But for people who are getting into this and who want to start integrating that left and right side, that imagination and that reality-based thinking, because we all know that we need both of those in order to self-actualize, right? We need both of those sides. What would you recommend as a good way to? We were talking about being a parent before. When you were when you were bringing your children up in a spiritual as well as a materialist tradition, what were the kind of things you did to do that, to start them out?
Well, sadly, my sons have no interest in any of this stuff whatsoever. So I wasn't able to be a very good guide for them for that. But I mean, there's a huge amount of material out there. to discover and start reading.
What's a good 101 text for people who might like Jung might blow them away? Like, is there like a kid's guide to Jung?
No, I'm trying to think. Jung's a bit difficult to start with himself, but the thing that got me going was Colin Wilson's work, and he has a book called Super Consciousness, which is one of the last things he wrote, and it's kind of it's sort of his how-to, as it were, a kind of DIY approach to understanding consciousness and being able to generate these more vivid states, these integrated states. And it's a short book. Actually, I taught a course on it for the California Institute of Integral Studies, an online course a couple years ago. And he writes very well. He writes very clearly, and it'll give you a fundamental idea about how he approaches these things. It's, I'm trying to think in terms of actually sort of, well, if you want to get a good, I can't, I can just say my own book, I'm sorry to give my own plug, but
no, please do.
My book, Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, it's a short book, and it's an overview, pretty much things we've been talking about. It doesn't give you sort of practices to do, but it's a way of understanding. So, and I think that's very important. I think in some ways the response or the reaction to the kind of restrictions and constraints of the Western mainstream intellectual kind of tradition, which is about ideas and theory and abstract and all, reasoning and all that kind of thing. The reaction to that went very much into experience and very much into practice. And, it's not about ideas, it's about doing and that kind of thing. And that's true. But I do think you do need to have some idea of what you're doing. You can get the experience, but to understand what the experience means in a broader context, and not just, like people take, psychedelics or something else, and they have an incredible cosmic conscious experience, and then they just, next week they're doing exactly the same thing that they were doing. So you can have the experience, but you need to sort of be able to translate the experience into some kind of knowledge that actually changes how you understand things. And that's what I try to do in the book, is to kind of give a kind of baseline kind of idea, like, well, what is taking place? Like what's taking place in our history, throughout, Western history, what's taking place in ourselves now, because we're a product of that kind of history. And I think we're at a very good place in order to bring about some of this integration, because like never before, there's so much material available. I mean, there's a lot of rubbish too, so you need to practice discrimination. But there's an enormous amount of material available on the net. And if anyone is really serious about this, they'll find their way. They'll find their way to something.
And obviously, this is the time to start thinking positive things, because we know that there's people on the other side thinking negative things.
Well, they're thinking very positively about some things that we might consider negative. So, well,
that's true.
I just want to say, I'll meet you at the Hypnagogo.
Yay! I'll see you there, Gary.
So for people who want to pick up Gary's books, make sure you check out the show notes for this episode, othersidepodcast.com/191. That's where you're going to find the show notes for this episode, and you're going to be able to pick up Gary's books, and you're going to be able to, the Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. You're going to be able to take a look at that and go right there and grab it. I'd recommend it. I'd also recommend Secret History of Consciousness, because Allison got that for me for a gift, a long time ago. And that was one of the things that really opened my mind to a lot of this stuff. So, Gary, next time you have a book, or next time we'll have to chat with you again, because it's really been a pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much. I look forward to that.
Thank you so much, Gary.
My pleasure.
Well, I didn't mean to fanboy out there. I think I've kept it pretty cool.
You did all right, Mike.
Sometimes I squee a little bit. But he's just got a lot of cool stories.
It's understandable, though.
Well, he was there during what I think is the most exciting time in rock and roll culture. And I know that some people would be like, oh man, that South and like the Elvis Sun Studios kind of thing, that 1950s Memphis thing is the most exciting time of rock and roll culture. Or you could say 1960s in London with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But I am most interested in the mid 1970s in New York City.
It's an exciting time.
So that's
it was
right, and so that's why I love talking to people who was there, who was part of that movement, of what I think would be like, if I could go back anywhere. People say like, oh, if you could go back in time, where would you go back? And that's where I would go.
Cool.
What I would do is I would make a duplicate of somebody there. I would disguise myself as them, kill them, and then live as that person for a while.
All right.
That's what I'd do if I could go back in time.
Sounds like a good strategy.
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to work, but we're going to give it a try. Anyway, we want to thank Gary for a really fun interview. And
yes, and thanks Allison from MilwaukeeGhosts.com
for helping out, and Allison organized the interview. After I failed through his publicist a couple of times, Allison just took the bull by the horns and said, why don't I just contact him on Facebook? And what do you know? There you go.
Gotta love her.
Yeah.
Thanks, Allison.
Yeah, for grabbing that rock and roll bull by his horns. Anyway, the song this week is inspired by actually one of the people that when I first read The Secret History of Consciousness that Gary introduced me to was a woman named Helena Blavatsky. So they call her Madame Blavatsky. And she's like this Western esoteric writer, con woman, spiritualist, all this stuff at the end of the 19th century. And she writes a book called The Secret Doctrine, which is basically a combination of like the Western thought. So if you take Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and some of their transcendentalist philosophy. And
that's the good stuff.
Yeah, and that's the classic stuff we all read in high school or whatever. And then you combine that with East Indian philosophy. So she went in and she did a lot of research of the different East Indian philosophers in the Bhagavad Gita and all that kind of stuff. And so she integrates all that into her book, The Secret Doctrine. And the first stanza of The Secret Doctrine is about this, and this is a very Hindu idea, the night of the universe, that everything is cyclical, and you get to a point where there's our universe as it is now, where there's things, we're talking, we're living, all that kind of stuff. And then the cycle goes of death and rebirth, and the death happens and there's nothing for a while, like the period before the Big Bang, or the time where they eventually say that the heat death of the universe, where it's all going to end.
Whoa.
And we're just going to be circling around in the cold. And so it's funny because science has its own version. So there's a materialist version of this idea, and the idea is the cycle begins again. And this has been this East Indian philosophy for thousands of years. And it's called the night of the universe. And just thought that'd be a fun idea for a lullaby saying, good night, universe. We'll see you again soon.
All right. Well, let's give it a listen, huh?
All right. So here's a little Sunspot doing the night of the universe. Good night, universe, good night. Where everything will sleep until the morning's light. The wheel has come to rest, the clock has stopped again. You won't need to dream where there is no pain. Open up your perfect eye and it will be a brand new day. I say good night, universe, good night. Good night, universe, good night. The sun has faded, but the hidden comes to light. A blissful empty, freedom from our brain. Sparks inside the fire, and all links in the chain. Until the great breath brings us to life again. I say good night, universe, good night. I say good night, Universe, good night. Good night. Universe, good night.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at othersidepodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
Like we said before, if you're part of our awesome Patreon community, we're going to be hanging out Tuesday, April 10th. We'd love to see you, 7:30 Central Time.
Definitely. Join the party.
Yeah, so please come and join us for a talk on there. If you can't make that one, we got more of them coming up. And if you don't know what our Patreon community is, those are the people who make See You on the Other Side podcast possible.
Yeah. And if you'd like to learn more about it or join that community, you can do that by visiting othersidepodcast.com/donate.
That's right.
And we want to give a big special thanks to our Patreon, Ned.
Yes.
Who we got to see last week, actually, during our performance in Sauk City.
Absolutely. We saw Dr. Ned. We were rocking in Sauk City at the Vintage Brewing Company. And I know we're going to see him again this Friday at the release party in Madison.
Yes.
Friday the 13th is lucky this year. It's lucky for you guys if you come on down to Madison for the Wonders of the World, Invisible World release party. And all our Patreons got a special package with that CD coming on the way. You could be part of that cool group too. It's just at othersidepodcast.com/donate.
I'll meet you at the Hypnagogo.